Should we attempt to re-establish the red-backed shrike, the butcher bird, to the British countryside, and if so, how? In this video I'm going to give a short overview of the natural history of red-backed shrikes and why I now think the kind of reintroduction of the species is probably worth a try. I'm going to first give a slide presentation on which I gave at the Knepp estate in Sussex a couple of weeks ago, and then I'll come back after that to discuss my thoughts further. So a few weeks ago I gave a presentation at Knepp in Sussex at a workshop looking at the return of the butcher bird, restoring the red-backed shrike to the British countryside as a regular breeding species. Here's a nice picture of a red-backed shrike. Anyone see any issues with that? Comments in the comment section below this video, please. I'll give you the answer. So it's sitting on a thorn bush. It's like a blackthorn, but with weird gorse needles coming out of the blackthorn stems. How odd. That's because this is AI generated. There are so few red-backed shrikes in the UK. I've not managed to get a photograph of a nice male sat on a thorn bush with a bumblebee. So I had to go into an AI image generator, Grok in this case, Elon Musk's horrible version. And the prompt was male red-backed shrike with a bumblebee in its beak, sat in a thorn bush, photorealistic. That was the prompt, and this is what it generated within seconds. Not perfect, but okay to illustrate this slide presentation. There are so few of your species that you can't get any decent photos of them. Anyway, moving on. So what exactly is a red-backed shrike? Well, it's a smallish predatory passerine that spends most of its life really in winter each year in Africa. So it's winters down in Africa, and then as a summer visitor to Northern Europe, Northwest Europe including the British Isles. They tend to arrive in the last couple of weeks in May and into early June. The males tend to arrive before the females, a day or two or up to a week before the females in suitable habitat. And this species is once widespread and in places common, but otherwise widespread across the British countryside into urban areas as well. Large commons, large parkland in urban areas along railway corridors, but it's now extinct as a regular breeding species. In the British Isles we still get the odd breeding record, and sometimes in prime habitat a pair will return several years in a row, or two pairs might return in the case of the Dartmoor breeding records that occurred a few years ago. So what makes a perfect red-backed shrike habitat? Well, to summarise fairly succinctly, it needs to be warm, it needs to be flower rich, absolutely has to be flower rich, has to be insect rich, large insects, I'll come back to that, lightly grazed with cattle ideally, because the cattle dung is really important for one of the key prey items, dung beetles. An open shrubby grassland, so basically a warm, open, flower-rich, shrubby grassland, widely scattered shrubby habitat. And where can you find this kind of habitat? Well, it used to be, that used to be a description of mixed farmland across the British Isles before the arrival of chemical agriculture and intensification. They also occur on heathlands, so they used to be on the Suffolk Sandlings, Breckland, the New Forest, and some upland areas, Dartmoor, Exmoor. And also areas of natural regeneration where you've got farmland that's been relaxed and shrubby habitat is emerging, and also rewilding areas which self-evidently in the early years are going to be naturally regenerating or assisted natural regeneration, open shrubby habitats. And this photograph illustrates what I think is prime red-backed shrike habitat. You've got got a hedgerow off to the left, and you've got an isolated mound of hawthorns and blackthorns and bramble. You've got species-rich taller grassland, but you've also got open ground. This is just a chalky track. This is on the chalk. And that open ground, disturbed ground, provides easily accessible prey as the beetles break cover and run across that track. A red-backed shrike that's sat up on a post or on a twig can fly down and capture it. And the flowers obviously drawing bumblebees and butterflies and that kind of stuff. So they're the key attributes of red-backed shrike habitat. I'm going to go through three of those key elements in turn, just to provide a little bit more detail. So I said widely spaced small shrub patches, that's element number one, with the odd scattered tree to build the nest in. When I say tree, I mean a small hawthorn or a blackthorn or crabapple, wild pear, that kind of thing, to lay the nest or to build the nest in. and then very scattered, widely scattered, small pockets of shrubby, thorny shrubs. So we've got is that bramble or wild rose? It looks like bramble on the right hand side of the photograph. It will sit up on one of those strands and just scan around an uninterrupted view of short grassland, disturbed ground and areas of tussocky grassland. And on the left there's a fence, kind of line of barbed wire fence with posts. Red-backed shrikes are quite happy to use those as kind of scanning positions as long as they've got uninterrupted view across prime habitat upon which they can capture prey either on the ground or in the air, bumblebees and butterflies and dragonflies in the air. So that's element one, widely scattered patches of shrubby elements, not big mounds of scrub, not big expanses of shrubby habitat, which turtledoves may like. These like much thinner, smaller patches widely spaced in open flower-rich grassland. Element number two, abundant herbaceous wildflowers throughout the breeding season, so between May to September. When they arrive on the breeding grounds, one of the key cues they're going to be using is lots of wildflowers to demonstrate this may be good nesting habitat. So you need wildflowers throughout May, throughout June, throughout September, throughout July, August, September, which is when they're nesting. They only have one clutch a year, but they will have replacement clutches, which can be quite late into August, September. And it's worth noting, so this photograph shows good shrike habitat, although they could do with being a bit more short grassland and bare ground. But there's a key point written here, which is that structurally enticing habitat with too few flowering plants and no dung from cattle or other grazers and browsers is probably an ecological trap. What I mean by that is that when they arrive in May, before there's a superabundance of bigger invertebrates, they may think, oh, this looks like really good habitat, but if there aren't the wildflowers drawing in key prey items throughout the breeding season, they may have very low productivity. If the chicks survive at all, they must have lots and lots of wildflowers. So it shouldn't only be structurally really good habitat, it needs to have all the prey items, and the herbaceous wildflowers are one of the key features, attributes of shrike habitat that draw in those prey items, which we'll come on to next. Element number three is abundant larger invertebrates. Emphasis on the larger, 10 millimetres and above. And there's 4 or 5 key groups of invertebrates they really love. So dung beetles, particularly associated with cattle dung. So the cattle must be grazing during the summer, but not grazing off all the wildflowers, and they must have clean cattle dung to attract dung beetles. There's another key invertebrate, key beetle species, which is a chafer. So various species of chafers are really key, especially in plague years. They can form a really high component of the diet of red-backed shrikes. So beetles first, then bumblebees. So lots and lots of wildflowers to draw in, just common bumblebees. They don't want the rarer stuff. They just want common old garden bumblebees, the ones you like to see in your garden. But you need loads and loads of wildflowers, such as thistles, knapweeds, bramble, all sorts of wildflowers that are going to draw in these larger invertebrates, such as bumblebees and also butterflies and dayfly moths, silver wire moths, and presumably hummingbird hawk moths as well, and also just the very common butterflies as well. Loads and loads of wildflowers is an absolute necessity for key shrike habitat, prime shrike habitat. Wet areas nearby, or lots and lots of hunting odonata, so damselflies and dragonflies. Some of the bigger dragonflies go quite large distances, so you don't necessarily need wetlands within the site, although that does help. Pond networks within your prime shrike habitat will help red-backed shrikes and also turtledoves potentially, and orthoptera, grasshoppers and bush crickets. So these 4 groups, the beetles, the bumblebees, and probably I should add butterflies and moths as well, odonata, dragonflies and damselflies, and orthoptera, bush crickets and grasshoppers are absolutely crucial prey items. So they do feed their chicks smaller prey items, very young chicks, but then they gradually move them on to these larger key invertebrates. So they must have those 4 groups of invertebrates in abundance throughout the breeding season. So yeah, throughout May to August, September. And in really good weather conditions, they prey on a very narrow spectrum of items, just because they're abundant, they're easily accessible if the weather conditions are really good. so they concentrate on what they really want, which are those larger invertebrates. In really damp, overcast, breezy conditions, redback shrikes hunt on a wider prey spectrum, so they'll also go for invertebrates and vertebrates as well that are not the absolute prime. It's not really what they want to be concentrating on, just because in those poorer conditions there are fewer of the prime prey items, the really key ones, so they'll hunt for whatever they can get effectively. So third element, lots and lots of large invertebrates. Why did we actually lose redback shrikes? It should be becoming quite clear. So first on the left we have the loss of shrubby habitats and the degradation of hedgerow networks. So redback shrikes love hedgerows. They love scattered shrubs amongst open grazed grassland, and that's been scrubbed out of the British countryside. And secondly, just a loss of wildflowers in pasture. Most pasture now, with cattle in, it's got the cattle, it's got dung, the dung is toxic, but it's got no wildflowers, so you're not drawing in the key invertebrates. There's going to be no dragonflies hunting invertebrates across this grassland because there just aren't any invertebrates to hunt because there are no wildflowers and the dung is toxic. So the wildflowers are gone from much of the British countryside, much conventional farmed grassland. A lot of the grassland is lay grassland that's been reseeded, and it's just grass. There's no wildflowers there at all. And as I said, the cattle dung is absolutely key, but it's got to be clean cattle dung, and it's got to be in summer because they need the dung beetles in summer when they're feeding their chicks. But they have to be free of anti-parasitic drugs. So these factors, this gradual intensification, the degradation of hedgerows and loss of shrubland habitat and the loss of wildflowers in grassland and toxification of dung, those kind of things led to a decline in productivity of the remaining redback shrike populations, a reduction in abundance, contraction in range and a breakdown of the metapopulation kind of structure of redback shrikes and their gradual loss from the British countryside. It wasn't that gradual, it's quite a steep decline as soon as intensification and chemical agriculture, fertilisers, in particular on grasslands, set in, the redback shrikes died out. And also when the population was up at its lowest ebb, when there were just a few pairs in the New Forest and in the Suffolk Sandlings and Breckland, egg collecting could have become a key issue. Egg collecting reduces the number of juveniles that a pair is able to produce, and because of adult mortality, the adults die and there are no recruits to replace the adults because egg collectors have collected out the nests and there are no juveniles being produced. But a silver lining is that climatic conditions are likely to become ever more favourable. It's already favourable, and it's always been pretty favourable for redback shrike. They're quite a cold tolerant species, but it's likely to get that much better. As we turn into Iberia, the lowlands may become a little bit less suitable, but the uplands may become a little bit better. We may get things like woodchats and lesser grey shrikes colonising. You never know. Let's move on. So how are they doing on the near continent? It's interesting really. So after a significant decline in abundance and range in the new UK and across northwestern Europe, there's actually signs of an upsurge on the near continent, particularly in northern France, Belgium in particular, and the Netherlands, and also parts of Spain where they actually appear to be redistributing themselves up elevation, as up elevation farmland begins to be abandoned and perhaps the lowland plains become too hot for them. Perhaps they're moving up elevation, but the general picture is in places there's been an increase in northwestern Europe in the last decade or so, probably driven by a run of really favourable summers, which has boosted productivity, so more chicks being raised successfully to fledging, and also clearly habitat creation. So in around Bargeveen in the Netherlands, there's been quite a lot of open shrubland habitat creation. In Belgium, there's been some specific projects which redback shrikes have responded to. And as I said, in Spain, they may be moving into abandoned farmland in some upland areas, which isn't going to last very long because that abandoned farmland is turning into woodland, which is no good for redback shrikes. But there are positive signs, and if they begin to saturate habitat on the near continent, we may see an uptick in the spring arrivals of redback shrikes. We haven't seen that over the last decade or so. We get occasional really good years, so I think last year, 2024, was a really good year, so there were lots of spring arrivals. Didn't really lead to very much in terms of a breeding population. I think there's one breeding pair. in the UK, but if we do see an uptick in spring arrivals because they're beginning to saturate the habitat on the near continent, they may recolonise. You never know. What do we actually need to do then to get them back, to induce them to return to the UK, return of the butcherbird? So there's three key opportunities as far as I can see. One is to create large blocks of really, really good habitat through arable reversion and grasslands enhancement in particular. Second one is enhancing the general quality of wider farmland habitats at a regional or a fairly large scale over tens of square kilometres to provide enough space for metapopulations to begin to rebuild. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And we've got those birds overshooting and arriving in spring, but there just aren't enough of them. They're just not meeting each other. So you've got males that go into prime habitat, really good quality habitat, but there just aren't enough females going through, so they're just not pairing up. So we might be able to supplement that through reintroduction. So just boosting the numbers that do actually return in spring to increase the probability of birds actually pairing up successfully in existing and newly created large blocks of habitat and in the wider countryside on farmland. So reintroduction. So just to recap, there are currently too few in spring. We still get them in decent habitat, but they usually fail to pair up. So there was a good example of this of a male at Knepp a few years ago in really good habitat, absolutely feasting on dragonflies, but a female just didn't turn up. It was in really good habitat, but it couldn't pair up because there was no female available. Too few arriving in spring is a real problem. The Dartmoor population is an interesting example of where they did attempt to recolonise, but that population just fizzled out. And that's probably because it was an isolated population because of very low natal fidelity and poor kind of natural adult survivorship. Those adults, when they died, were not replaced by juveniles. So basically you need a population of populations, you need several clusters of pairs producing juveniles in order to sustain each small cluster of red-backed shrikes. If you just have one, the juveniles that are born in that one little population all disperse away. They don't come back into their natal site, so they're not going to replace the adults. That's outbreeding. They're actively avoiding that. You know, it's wired into their genes to disperse the juveniles. The adults, on the other hand, show a slightly higher breeding site fidelity or philometry, so the adults will return to a breeding site they successfully nested at, and that's probably what happened on Dartmoor. The adults did return for as long as they survived, the juveniles didn't. The adults died off, no replacement, the population died off. So we may see a increase in spring overshoots given the increase on the near continent, but over the last decade or so, the number overall, if you take the mean as flatlined, or there's been a slight dip in the numbers returning in spring, well, on the south coast and east coast, for instance. So sustained recolonisation from overshoots alone seems a very distant prospect. So what about reintroduction? Essentially, you need to source founders for a conservation breeding population from donor sites. So that would most likely be collecting juveniles or eggs from the near continent. They obviously relay, so that doesn't harm the donor population. Transferring those chicks or eggs to the UK and using those to found a conservation breeding population. You need to build a lot of infrastructure, a lot of capex in terms of breeding facilities, so aviaries, conservation breeding aviaries, and staffing to manage the conservation breeding programme. And you would release juveniles and perhaps some adults at fledging time within suitable habitats such as Knepp, Salisbury Plain Training Area, Purbeck, areas in Dorset. And you'd aim to build up a regional population of populations or a meta-population, so you have that kind of interchange of juveniles between breeding populations each spring when they return. So that's reintroduction. Here's a kind of a illustrative image of that, a bird's eye view of what that might look like. So hatch circles are the release areas, so several release areas, because you want to simulate a population of populations. So several small populations. Created shrike shrublands, the red dots are kind of speculated pairs breeding in these habitat blocks. And as you can see, you have kind of large patches of shrike shrublands, and you have natal dispersal between those patches with those breeding pairs. Release sites would be probably a kilometre apart, up to 10, 20, 30 kilometres apart. At the start I'd have them fairly close. So Nep, for example, you could have 2 release sites within a site the size of Nep, 3,000 hectares or so. If you went somewhere like Porton Down, you could have 3 release sites probably, if you include Salisbury Plain Training Area, which is 28,000 hectares of good habitat. And also illustrated here is the improved kind of wider farmland habitat based on hedgerow networks, with red dots being breeding pairs on wider farmland. So there are your elements: shrike shrublands, large blocks of shrike habitat, enhanced wider farmlands kind of matrix, and then your release sites within that kind of region. In terms of scale, what am I looking at here? Size of the Isle of Wight illustrated here. That's a kind of regional scale reintroduction programme within which you may have 2 or 3 release sites ultimately. And it's worth bearing in mind you need to release loads and loads and loads of birds very quickly, so as many as you can each year for a shorter space of time, rather than releasing small numbers each year over a much longer period of time, because you're trying to get over this encounter rate problem, so lower return rate. So in spring you want as many birds returning as possible so they meet each other. So it doesn't make any sense to release a small number. You want to release loads and loads, 150, 200 juveniles, even more if you can, each year over a decade, 15 years. So you're going to need a big conservation breeding programme, a big capex, capital expenditure on aviaries to house your conservation breeding population to yield enough juveniles to then release each year over a decade, 15 years say. So just a reiteration, we're coming to the end now, you'll be pleased to hear. Reiteration: they need warm, flower-rich, lightly grazed habitat with scattered small patches of scrub, shrublands, with the odd emergent small tree to build the nest in. We already have a fair amount of reasonable habitat. I've already said Nep, Purbeck's brilliant. Maybe the New Forest, probably overgrazed. Salisbury Plain Training Area, Porton Down, large areas in Dorset away from Purbeck. But we need to create lots and lots of additional really high quality habitat, which is relatively easy to create. And I've written a little book on how to create Shrike Habitat. Down in the corner there you can see the cover. Go on to Amazon, it's called Shrike Shrublands. Buy the £9.99 version of it, not the cheaper version, which is a pirated version of the book. And that sets out exactly how to create shrike habitat of a very high quality. And then we should supplement the small numbers that are already arriving in spring. This isn't really a reintroduction project, this is a supplementation of a native species that comes here every spring but just fails to meet up. So we need to supplement that through releasing birds each fledging time, so basically late summer onwards. We need to release lots and lots of birds each summer over several sites at a regional scale over 10 to 15 years, I would guess. Lots of birds from multiple sites will mitigate the low natal site fidelity or philopatry that is a key natural characteristic of this species, and should increase the encounter rate of returners in spring. So basically they'll find each other in spring. I should just make a point about Bargeveen, which is a celebrated Netherlands wetland peatland restoration site that has, I think it's had up to 200 pairs of red-backed shrikes in a couple of thousand hectares of mostly wet habitat. That has very high return rates, so the juveniles come back to that site, colouring in as showed each year, at quite a high rate, much higher than under more typical circumstances. And I think the reason for that is because it's a very isolated site, so they're basically forced to return to that site because it's embedded within a highly unsuitable region. It's like having a prime shrike shrubland embedded within the East Anglian fens, which would be a really good habitat to create shrike habitat, or really good regions to create shrike habitat. But the reason Bargeveen has higher return rates, more birds returning in spring that are actually fledged at Bargeveen, is because it's an isolated site, so there's less leakage, as the ecologists would say. The same principle for corncrake. When you're doing a reintroduction, the idea was that you'd introduce them into isolated blocks of habitat, so the juveniles, the recruits, would be in a sense, forced to return back into that isolated habitat rather than being lost by leaking out into the wider landscape, which is unsuitable. So thank you to NEP in particular, who've created absolutely superb habitat on the NEP estate for redback shrikes. They don't have redback shrikes back yet, but hopefully they will do in the not too distant future. And also the RSPB in Natural England, which supported the Reintroduction feasibility study work that I carried out a couple of years ago, the first stages of it. And I very much hope that something can be, some sort of supplementation can go ahead. I've kind of ummed and ahed about this. I think because of the low natal site fidelity issue, it's quite a difficult project, but I think it's worth a try. So I hope you enjoyed that little slide presentation. Do tell me what you think in the comment section. We're now in a nice bit of shrike habitat here. This is in Exeter, in Devon. Obviously they nested not too far from here on Dartmoor a few years ago. I'm going to just turn this around. Let's describe some of the key components of a pretty good shrike habitat. Obviously they're not here, but even so it still illustrates the points. So you've got a bit too much tree cover there. Got nice emerging bramble though. They love bramble. They love kind of perches embedded within open grassland. And they love this rabbit or cattle graze lawns as well with disturbance. Rabbits are ideal because they do disturb the ground, and what you've got here is your ground beetles and your dung beetles. Not many dung beetles here because there's no cattle grazing this area, so it's not ideal from that respect. But the rabbits create this open ground which the beetles of various sorts, carabids and dung beetles, they're going to have to break cover between the long grass over there and scurry across this. And if there's a little bit of scrub, little kind of wild rose or bramble patch embedded here, they'd be perched on there and they'd be able to kind of fly down and grab the beetle, which is their one of their number one prey items. You've got some nice ragwort here, just going to draw in the bumblebees. That's the second key prey item. Bumblebees, butterflies, things come into nectar, wildflowers. So you need this kind of juxtaposition of grazed lawns, grazed by bunnies in this case, and more tussocky grassland full of wildflowers. There's a marbled white butterfly, they'd certainly eat one of those. They capture things like butterflies in the air on still warm days like this. You can see there's a nice scattered planted trees here which they would perch on. They're not at all concerned about slightly urbanised urban edge habitat. So back in the day they used to nest on Southampton Commons and I think Wimbledon Common and Woolwich Common. Some of the inner city urban roughy shrubby habitats used to support redback shrikes. Maybe sink populations of them so that maybe they weren't as productive as the out in the sticks, out in the countryside where they would have been less disturbed and less prone to egg collecting, that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, it does show the species is fairly adaptable. Here you've got a lovely illustration here. You've got strands of bramble over, nice butterfly there, over kind of flowering bramble. So lots of bees on the bramble flowers. Lots of bush crickets, Roselle's bush cricket, dark green bush cricket, that kind of stuff. And then you've got bare ground down here with the rabbits scuffing up some of the soil. Again, exposing some of the key prey items to hunting redback shrikes. And the tussocky areas are where all the grasshoppers are going to be. And they're going to hop out and bask on some of these areas of soil, the odd mole hill perhaps, basking grasshoppers and any kind of trails that go through, cattle trails. Got some lovely thistles, which are going to draw in various invertebrates, which they're going to go for. So I don't know if historically redback shrikes have ever nested here. They probably did. This is University of Exeter campus. They certainly would have occurred on migration through here in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Again, just to illustrate, the university's planted something in a exclosure here. If you're creating a shrike shrubland habitat, this is a good way of creating those little mounds of scrub that redback shrikes need to hunt from. You've got this little enclosure. So here they've planted a tree, not native unfortunately, with some wooden posts and some rabbit fencing. A shrike will sit on one of these wooden posts and scan around and hunt from it, and obviously in time the bramble will colonise, and the you know, if you were doing this on your farm, if you were trying to create Red-backed Shrike habitat, you'd position one of these exclosure areas to keep the browsers and grazers out. Probably one of these, I don't know, 4 square metres in terms of the area enclosed, probably 8 to 10 metres apart. So they don't need to be close. You don't want them to be close at all because it needs to be very nice open habitat. And you would chuck a load of blackberries in there, or take some cuttings from bramble and plant it in. Plant a few whips of hawthorn and wild rose, wild pear, crabapple, that kind of stuff, just to get a mound of open scrubby habitat develop. And if you've got something like a crabapple in there, or a slightly taller hawthorn, that's where they're going to build the nest. It's a chiff-chaff up there, very nice. So this isn't the perfect habitat, but it does illustrate the kind of the structure. You need more wildflowers in the sward basically. This is good for grasshoppers without a doubt, but there aren't really the high abundance and knapweeds and that kind of thing that are going to be drawing in a lot of the bees and the butterflies. But there is lots of bramble. It's worth saying that Nep, the male that occurred there, I seem to remember just loved odonatus, damselflies and dragonflies in particular, that were just hunting over the kind of bramble and grassy swards. So they do switch prey items. So if the habitat is particularly good for odonatus, say, as bargavine and Nep probably are, then that's what they're going to focus on. Big, large invertebrates, big sacks of protein. It's also worth saying vertebrates, they're not a key prey item, I wouldn't have said, but they certainly do hunt lizards, baby birds, fledged blue tits, fledged whitethroats in this kind of shrubby habitat. They'll go for those opportunistically, but it's not, don't focus too much on vertebrates. Small mammals as well, kind of voles and wood mice, that kind of stuff. They're really good bonus when they can grab one, but they're not a key prey item, I wouldn't have said, although each sack of protein from an invertebrate is a far bigger one than your average dragonfly. Anyway, tell me what you reckon in the comments section. Should we, being the UK conservation community, attempt to reintroduce Red-backed Shrike to the UK by supplementing the migrants that come through? I'm now in favour of it. I've been umming and ahhing, fairly sceptical of it, but now I've reframed it in my mind as a kind of a supplementation of birds that are coming across anyway, just to try and build up that kind of population of populations, the meta population, and get over the low encounter rates. I'm now more in favour of it, I think. And also it's no regrets in terms of the habitat creation element of it. The habitat that Red-backed Shrikes love are also really good for things like other species of conservation concern, like turtle dove, windchat, grasshopper warbler, I suppose, nightingale in wetter conditions, cuckoo without a doubt, various bat species if you have the clean cattle dung especially, glowworms, hedgehogs. There's all manner of species that need flower rich, open, shrubby grasslands with light, cattle grazing that's free of ivermectins. The list just goes on and on. The more I think about it, cell buntings, dormouse. On the Isle of Wight, most of the dormice are in open shrubby habitats, not woodland. They're not really a woodland species, to be honest. So it's no regrets. The more of that kind of habitat we can create, the more nature recovery we will get. So, yeah, tell me what you think in the comments section. I know quite a few seasoned ecologists are opposed to Red-backed Shrike reintroduction. I'm now much more in favour of it, but I'd love to hear your comments. Thank you for watching, and do pick up a copy of that Shrike Shrubland book if you're really keen on creating a habitat for Red-backed Shrikes, which will also work for turtle doves and cuckoos and all manner of other species. Thank you for watching.